If I were a ruthless man, I would get you into a corner and say, now, let me ask you some questions. Why do you start with the assumption that your interviewee is always dumb and that you are smarter than him?
Can anyone truly outwit a Hard Talk interviewer? For decades, the BBC's Hard Talk TV program has been infamous for its relentless questioning, its confrontational tone, and its fearless hosts who grill world leaders, tycoons, and celebrities with surgical precision. No pleasantries, no soft landings, just an unyielding pursuit of truth. Yet in one remarkable encounter, the balance of power shifted. The advantage didn't belong to the interviewer, it belonged to the interviewee, Kuan Yew, the founding Prime Minister of Singapore, known for his sharp intellect and unshakable composure. What unfolded became one of the most memorable clashes between East and West on global television. A verbal duel between Hard Talk's Tim Sebastian and one of Asia's most formidable minds. Lee wasn't merely a politician, he was a strategist, a statesman, and a trained lawyer who had spent decades defending Singapore's right to define its own path. And in this interview, every exchange revealed the same truth. Kuan Yew wasn't there to react to questions. He was there to dismantle them piece by piece with precision, wit, and an unyielding belief in his vision for Singapore.
And the people can handle the freedom of democracy.
When did I say that?
Some years ago.
No. Be very careful when you quote me, because I'm very careful how I phrase myself, because it's part of my legal training.
But so you don't agree with that?
No, just a moment. You give me my quote and the context in which it was placed. Don't just pluck out a few words and toss it at me unexpectedly in an interview and expect me to crumble.
No, I'm not. I'm expecting you to answer it.
Why should I answer something which I may never have uttered?
Right from the start, Tim Sebastian tries to ambush Kuan Yew with a past quote he made about democracy. But Lee's reaction was immediate and controlled. He didn't respond defensively. He went straight for the weakness in the question itself. He reminded the interviewer that quotes taken out of context were meaningless, and that as a lawyer, he chose his words carefully. This wasn't a simple rebuttal. It was a lesson in precision. By questioning the premise of the question itself, Lee reversed the power dynamic. Instead of being the one on trial, he became the examiner. The exchange demonstrated not only his confidence, but his mastery of rhetoric. He made it clear that if he was to be judged, it would be on facts, not fragments. In this short moment, the tension shifted. The Hard Talk format, designed to corner guests, suddenly found itself disarmed. Kuan Yew's message was subtle but unmistakable. He would not allow anyone to define his words for him.
All the criticism that Singapore has had, what effect does that have on you?
Well,
Do you mind it?
It's part of life. I read it. Sometimes I take note of it. I improve. Look at Singapore. Would anybody be interested in Singapore if it were a failure?
Criticism was something Kuan Yew had lived with for decades. Western observers often described Singapore as efficient but authoritarian, wealthy but sterile, disciplined but unfree. And yet, as Lee pointed out, the very reason the West was so fascinated by Singapore was because it had succeeded. The city-state had gone from a swampy trading post to one of the most prosperous nations in the world, all within a single generation. In the face of these criticisms, Lee didn't deny that his government was strict. He acknowledged it. But he argued that it was precisely this firmness that made Singapore exceptional. His response reflected his deep belief in outcomes over rhetoric. To him, a government's legitimacy came not from how eloquently it spoke of freedom, but from how effectively it improved the lives of its people. It was a philosophy that often clashed with Western ideals, but one that resonated deeply across Asia. Singapore's transformation under his leadership had defied conventional wisdom. It had no natural resources, no hinterland, and no tolerance for corruption. Yet it became a global hub for trade, finance, and innovation. So when asked about criticism, Lee's reply carried a quiet defiance. People only criticize success. Failure, after all, draws no attention.
What about PAP? What about the opposition party? They're not particularly happy with it. Singapore, they call it.
They get a chance every 4 to 5 years. They get a chance every meeting of Parliament. The cameras are there. Who's the ball? If there was such a marvelous proposition, I would have been tossed out years ago. It's one of the few countries where people have the right to toss a government out, and they have not done so.
Tim Sebastian pressed on the issue of political freedom, a recurring theme in Western coverage of Singapore. To the interviewer, the dominance of Lee's People's Action Party seemed proof of an uneven playing field. But Lee turned that line of questioning on its head. He reminded his interviewer that elections in Singapore were free, that the opposition could campaign, and that every citizen had the right to vote. Then he made a striking point. If the opposition truly had better ideas, why had the people not voted them in? In that single remark, Lee reframed the entire debate. Instead of discussing the absence of democracy, he shifted the conversation to the results of democracy. Singaporeans, he argued, were not coerced. They simply made rational choices. This response revealed Lee's understanding of human behaviour. Singaporeans valued stability, competence, and honesty. For a generation that had lived through colonial rule, racial riots, and poverty, these mattered more than political theatrics. By the time of this interview, Lee's government had delivered rising incomes, world-class infrastructure, and safety unmatched in the region. In that context, his argument held weight. He wasn't claiming perfection. He was pointing out that legitimacy was measured not by Western standards, but by the will of his people. In one deft move, he turned a critique of power into proof of performance.
They have criticized the human rights record, the number of executions, for instance.
They may believe that if you're kind to drug traffickers, you get a better society. In America, they're changing their minds and they're sending people back to death row.
Here, the interview entered one of the most contentious issues in Singapore's reputation, the death penalty. For years, human rights organisations like Amnesty International had condemned Singapore for its mandatory executions for drug trafficking. To Western audiences, it was an unforgivable policy, harsh, unrelenting, and incompatible with modern human rights values. But Lee Kuan Yew's defence was unapologetic. He viewed drugs not as a moral issue, but as an existential threat. Singapore, a small nation with open borders and a high standard of living, was an ideal target for traffickers. To him, leniency meant societal decay. Every addict, he said, destroyed not just themselves but their families, a ripple effect that corroded the very fabric of society. He also drew attention to Western hypocrisy. In the United States, drug epidemics were spiralling out of control. Even as they criticised Singapore, American politicians were toughening their own stances on crime. Lee's argument wasn't emotional, it was utilitarian. His government's duty was to protect the innocent, even if it meant harsh punishment for the guilty. This view may have been controversial abroad, but within Singapore, it commanded broad support. The country's zero-tolerance approach kept its streets safe and its youth largely free from the scourge of narcotics. In this exchange, Lee reminded his interviewer that moral debates are meaningless if they ignore real-world consequences. For him, justice wasn't about ideology. It was about preserving order in a fragile society.
But the per capita rate of executions in Singapore is much higher than in the United States,
Have you worked it out?
according to Amnesty International.
Have they worked it out
Apparently.
accurately? Per capita of what? Per capita of drug traffickers or per capita of population of Singapore? I am executing foreign drug traffickers. What's Amnesty talking about? Do they know what's happening? Do they ask themselves, what would happen if we send them all to prison for 5, 10 years, and we'll have to make more prisons because there'll be such an endless stream of them. And this is despite the death penalty, the rewards are so enormous that people are willing to risk it.
Lee's quick wit shone through in this moment. When confronted with statistics from Amnesty International, he immediately questioned their logic. It was a classic example of how he dismantled data not by rejecting it, but by exposing its flaws. He asked per capita of what exactly? Comparing Singapore's small population to that of a massive country like the United States, he argued, was meaningless. Moreover, he highlighted an uncomfortable fact. Many of those executed were foreign traffickers who knowingly entered Singapore despite clear warnings. This was not defiance for its own sake. It was an assertion of sovereignty, a reminder that Singapore would not be lectured by those who neither shared its history nor bore its risks. In a few sentences, Lee turned an accusation of brutality into a defense of national integrity.
Would you say that over the 31 years as you were Prime Minister that you were a ruthless man?
Do I look to you a ruthless man? Here I am being pilloried, excoriated,
By who?
abused by you.
Merely asked questions, I thought.
No, but every one of them is barbed and loaded, darts with a bit of arsenic in it.
This was perhaps the most revealing exchange of the entire interview. Tim Sebastian's question, whether Lee was ruthless, touched on the core of his international image. To many in the West, Lee Kuan Yew was the archetype of the stern Asian autocrat, a man who prized efficiency over empathy. But Lee's reply was neither defensive nor hostile. Instead, he countered with irony and intellect. He pointed out that the interviewer's questions were aggressive, even hostile, yet he remained calm. Was that ruthlessness or discipline? By reframing the tone of the interview itself, he demonstrated the difference between toughness and cruelty. To govern Singapore through crises, racial riots, economic uncertainty, regional threats, required steel. But it also required restraint. Lee saw leadership not as domination, but as responsibility. His answer encapsulated a fundamental truth about his rule. He was not ruthless for power's sake. He had to be strong for survival.
If I were a ruthless man, I would get you into a corner and say, now, let me ask you some questions. Why do you start with the assumption that your interviewee is always dumb and that you are smarter than him? Why do you assume that Asians are somehow unable to understand Western ways of life and that they would be so much better if they would become more like the West?
Here, the conversation transcended politics and entered the realm of philosophy. Lee Kuan Yew challenged not just his interviewer, but the very mindset of Western journalism. The unspoken belief that Western values were universal and that deviation from them signaled backwardness. He exposed the cultural bias embedded in the question. The West often viewed Asia through the lens of its own history, expecting every society to mirror its path toward liberal democracy. But Lee argued that civilizations evolve differently. Each society has its own context, traditions, and priorities. What worked in Western societies might not work in Southeast Asia. This was not an argument for authoritarianism. It was an argument for realism. By turning the question around, Lee demonstrated how easily moral superiority could become intellectual blindness. His challenge was not confrontational, it was deeply analytical. He forced the audience to reflect on a difficult truth. The world's diversity cannot be understood through a single moral template. In that instant, hard talk became more than a grilling. It became a mirror held up to the West itself.
Lee Kuan Yew, what does the future hold for you? What ambitions do you have?
At 74, I don't talk anymore of ambitions. I've either done what I could have done, or I am hardly likely to do it now. What I have done, I'm not ashamed of.
As the interview drew to a close, the final exchange became reflective. Lee Kuan Yew, then 74, looked back on his life's work with quiet conviction. He had transformed a fragile colony into a first-world state, instilled a culture of discipline and meritocracy, and positioned Singapore as a global powerhouse. He did not speak of legacy. He did not boast. Instead, he spoke with the calm assurance of a man who had already measured his achievements against history. There was humility in his words and finality. His mission, he seemed to say, was complete. What remained was not ambition, but reflection. In the end, this interview was more than just a media encounter. It was a clash of worldviews. Tim Sebastian represented the Western tradition of adversarial journalism, where truth is extracted through confrontation. Lee Kuan Yew embodied the Eastern philosophy of order, discipline, and collective survival. But what made this exchange remarkable was not who won, but what it revealed: the intellectual depth behind Singapore's founding leader. After all, he turned one of the toughest interviews on television into a masterclass in political thought. And long after the cameras stopped rolling, one truth remained. In the battle of words, few could outthink Lee Kuan Yew. But Lee Kuan Yew wasn't the only Singaporean leader who could hold his own against a hard talk interviewer. In 2015, Singapore's then Deputy Prime Minister Tharman Shanmugaratnam faced off with BBC host Stephen Secour at the St. Gallen Symposium. And what followed became a masterclass in calm intellect and persuasive clarity. How did Tharman manage to turn a tough interrogation into a thoughtful conversation? Watch this video to uncover the full story.